I never thought my mother-in-law's birthday dinner would turn into such a nightmare. Living in Boston's affluent Beacon Hill neighborhood, I had spent weeks planning every detail of the evening, determined to prove to Helena that I was worthy of her precious son, James. Our relationship had always been strained, marked by her subtle disapproval and my desperate attempts to win her over. The autumn evening started perfectly. The maple trees outside our brownstone had just begun to turn golden, and I had transformed our dining room into what I hoped would be the setting for a breakthrough in our relationship. The table was set with my grandmother's antique china, crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier, and the aroma of carefully prepared dishes filled the air. Helena arrived precisely at 7, wrapped in an expensive cashmere shawl that probably cost more than my monthly salary as a high school English teacher. Her perfectly coiffed silver hair and impeccable makeup made me feel somehow underdressed in my own home, despite wearing my best dress. James greeted her with his usual warmth, while I hovered nearby, trying not to show how much my hands were shaking. "Sarah," she said, air-kissing my cheek, "the place looks quaint." Even her compliments felt like tiny daggers, but I was determined to make this evening work. Our other guests, James's sister Emily and her husband Tom, along with a couple of Helena's closest friends from her country club, filled the room with cheerful conversation that helped ease the tension. I had been meticulous in planning the menu. Helena had made it known to everyone for years that she was deathly allergic to shellfish, particularly shrimp. She never failed to mention it at every restaurant we visited, making sure the waiters understood the gravity of her condition. I had carefully vetted every ingredient, triple-checking labels and calling suppliers to ensure there was no risk of cross-contamination. The appetizers went smoothly, a butternut squash soup that even Helena praised, albeit with the qualification that it almost matched her late mother's recipe. As I brought out the main course, a herb-crusted rack of lamb with roasted vegetables and a red wine reduction sauce, I noticed something odd in Helena's expression. Her eyes fixed on the plate with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. She hesitated before taking her first bite, making a show of examining the food. The conversation around the table continued, but I could feel the weight of her scrutiny. Then, with deliberate slowness, she took a small bite. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Helena's face contorted. Her hand flew to her throat, and she made a choking sound that cut through all conversation. The fork clattered against her plate as she pushed back from the table, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Before anyone could react, she slumped sideways, falling from her chair with a terrible thud. The dining room erupted into chaos. James rushed to his mother's side, shouting for someone to call 911. Emily was crying, her husband Tom trying to help James while fumbling with his phone. Helena's friends hovered helplessly, their faces pale with shock. And I stood there, frozen, my mind refusing to process what was happening. "What did you put in the food?" James's voice cut through my daze, sharp with panic and something else. "Accusation? Mom? Mom, can you hear me?" Helena lay motionless on our dining room floor, her expensive shawl twisted around her like a fallen angel's wings. The next few minutes were a blur of paramedics bursting through our front door, their efficient movements and urgent voices filling our carefully arranged dining room. They worked quickly, loading Helena onto a stretcher while asking rapid-fire questions about allergies and medications. James went with them in the ambulance, leaving me behind without a word or a backward glance. I sank into a dining room chair after everyone left, staring at the half-eaten meals growing cold on bone china plates. The evening had transformed from my carefully orchestrated attempt at family harmony into something that felt like a scene from a crime drama. My hands shook as I tried to reconstruct every step of my preparation, every ingredient I had used. How could this have happened? I had been so careful, obsessively so. Emily and Tom stayed behind to help clean up, though I could feel the tension in the air. Emily avoided making eye contact with me as she wrapped leftover food in aluminum foil. Tom tried to fill the silence with awkward small talk about the weather and upcoming holidays, but his words felt hollow in the wake of what had just happened. As I mechanically loaded dishes into the dishwasher, my mind kept replaying Helena's collapse. Something about it nagged at me, like a word on the tip of my tongue that I couldn't quite recall. I had watched enough medical shows to know what anaphylactic shock looked like. My best friend in college had a peanut allergy, and I had once seen her reaction to an accidentally contaminated cookie. This had seemed different somehow. My phone remained silent throughout the evening, no updates from James. Each time I checked it, I saw our last text exchange from that morning, him telling me how proud he was of me for putting so much effort into his mother's birthday, me sending back a heart emoji. Now those messages felt like artifacts from another lifetime. Around midnight, after Emily and Tom had finally left with promises to let me know if they heard anything, I found myself alone in our too-quiet house. The dining room still smelled of herbs and wine, but now the scent felt cloying, oppressive. I walked through each room, turning off lights, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. In our bedroom, I changed into my pajamas and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my phone. Should I call the hospital? Would they even tell me anything? The thought of hearing accusations in James's voice again kept me from dialing. Instead, I curled up on his side of the bed, inhaling the familiar scent of his pillow, and tried to make sense of everything that had happened. Sleep eluded me as my mind raced through possibilities. Had there been cross-contamination at the butcher shop? Had one of the herbs been mislabeled? Had I somehow missed an ingredient in the wine reduction sauce? But with each scenario I played out, that nagging feeling grew stronger. Something about Helena's reaction hadn't seemed quite right. Dawn was breaking over Boston when my phone finally buzzed with a text from James. Mom's stable. Staying at the hospital. We'll call later. 7 words that simultaneously relieved and terrified me. She was alive, but the brevity of the message spoke volumes about where I stood. As I watched the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, I couldn't shake the feeling that this dinner had changed everything. What I didn't know then was just how right I was, but not in the way I feared. This was just the beginning of a story that would unravel everything I thought I knew about family, truth, and the lengths some people will go to maintain control. Massachusetts General Hospital was eerily quiet at 6 a.m. when I finally worked up the courage to visit. I had spent the night tossing and turning, replaying every moment of the dinner in my mind until I couldn't stand the solitude of our empty house anymore. The morning air was crisp with early October chill as I made my way through the hospital's sliding doors, clutching a paper cup of coffee from the Dunkin' Donuts across the street like a shield. The fluorescent lights made everything look harsh and unreal. I found my way to the information desk, where a tired-looking nurse directed me to the 4th floor. My heels clicked against the linoleum floors, each step echoing my anxiety. I hadn't heard from James since his brief text, and I wasn't sure what kind of reception awaited me. I found him slumped in an uncomfortable-looking chair outside Helena's room, still wearing his dress shirt from the dinner, now badly wrinkled. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept at all. When he saw me, he straightened up, but his usual warm smile was nowhere to be seen. "How is she?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper in the quiet hallway. "Stable," he replied, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "They're keeping her for observation, but—" He trailed off, looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of confusion, suspicion, and something else I couldn't quite identify. A nurse emerged from Helena's room, checking something on her tablet. I seized the opportunity to ask about Helena's condition, hoping for some clarity about what had happened. "Oh, are you family?" the nurse asked, glancing between James and me. "I'm her daughter-in-law," I said, trying to sound confident despite feeling like an outsider. "I was there when it happened. I just wanted to understand. Was it definitely an allergic reaction?" The nurse, whose name tag read Mike, looked slightly confused. Actually, the initial tests didn't show any signs of anaphylaxis. Dr. Patterson noted it seems more like a vasovagal episode, basically, a fainting spell brought on by stress. Has she been under any particular pressure lately? My mind struggled to process this information. No allergic reaction? But Helena had been so adamant about her shellfish allergy for years. I'd seen her send back countless dishes at restaurants, lecture waiters, and even leave dinner parties if she wasn't completely confident about the food preparation. James was watching me intently as Mike continued explaining Helena's vital signs and treatment plan. I tried to keep my face neutral, but inside, my thoughts were racing. Something wasn't adding up, and judging by the way James was looking at me, he was having similar doubts. After the nurse left, an uncomfortable silence fell between us. James stood up, pacing the short length of the hallway. "Sarah," he finally said, his voice tight with controlled emotion, "I need you to tell me exactly what you put in that food. Every ingredient." "James, I swear to you, I was incredibly careful," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "I checked everything multiple times. There wasn't any shellfish anywhere near that meal. I even used new cutting boards and utensils to avoid any possible cross-contamination." He nodded slowly, but I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. "Then why did this happen?" Mom's never had a reaction like this before without a reason. The words "never had a reaction like this before" echoed in my head. Come to think of it, in the 3 years I'd known Helena, I'd never actually seen her have an allergic reaction. She'd talked about them plenty, always with dramatic flair, but there had never been an incident. Not until my carefully planned dinner. Over the next few days, I threw myself into running our small bookstore in Harvard Square, trying to keep busy while James took time off work to help his mother recover. The store had been my sanctuary since I bought it 5 years ago, and now more than ever, I needed the comfort of familiar routines and the smell of books. My best friend Rachel, who worked at the cafe next door, started bringing me lunch every day, worried I wasn't eating properly. She listened patiently as I shared my growing suspicions about Helena's attack. "Something just feels off about the whole thing," I told her one afternoon, picking at a sandwich. The nurse said there was no sign of an actual allergic reaction. And when I think about it, Helena's always been dramatic about her allergy, but I've never seen any medical documentation. No EpiPen, nothing. Rachel, who had met Helena several times at various family functions, frowned thoughtfully. "Remember last Christmas, when she made that huge scene about the seafood restaurant James wanted to go to? She insisted we all change plans at the last minute. It seemed excessive, even for someone with an allergy. The more I thought about it, the more instances like that came to mind. Helena had used her alleged allergy to control situations countless times, changing dinner plans, making restaurants accommodate her specially, ensuring she was the center of attention at meals. Had it all been an act? But if it was, why would she take it so far? Faking a collapse at her own birthday dinner seemed extreme, even for Helena. Unless she had a bigger goal in mind. James's behavior was changing too. He started asking more pointed questions about the dinner preparation, about my relationship with his mother, about little incidents from the past that I had almost forgotten. It was as if he was building a case, but I wasn't sure against whom, me or his mother. One evening, about a week after the dinner, I was closing up the bookstore when James called. "I've been going through Mom's medical records," he said without preamble. "Sarah, I can't find any documented shellfish allergy. Not one hospital visit, not one prescription for an EpiPen, nothing." My hands shook as I held the phone. "What are you saying?" "I don't know what I'm saying," he replied, sounding tired and confused. "None of this makes sense. Mom's still insisting she had a reaction, but the doctors are saying otherwise. They're suggesting it might have been anxiety or stress. But..." He paused. "I've never known my mother to be anxious about anything." That night, I couldn't sleep again. I kept thinking about Helena's perfect timing, waiting until everyone was watching before taking that bite, making sure all eyes were on her when she collapsed. It had been theatrical, now that I thought about it. Almost too perfect. The next morning, I decided to do some investigating of my own. I called the hospital where Helena claimed to have first discovered her shellfish allergy 20 years ago. After several transfers and a lot of waiting on hold, I finally reached someone in records. "I'm sorry," the clerk told me, "but we have no record of any emergency room visits for Helena Windsor in that time period, let alone for an allergic reaction." I sat at my desk in the back of the bookstore, staring at the notes I'd been taking. A pattern was emerging, but I wasn't sure I was ready to face what it meant. If Helena had been lying about her allergy all these years, what else had she lied about? My cell phone buzzed with a text from Emily, James's sister. Can we meet? There's something you should know. We arranged to meet at a small cafe in Brookline, far from Helena's usual haunts. Emily looked nervous as she stirred her coffee, glancing around as if afraid we might be overheard. I found something in Mom's bathroom, she said quietly. I was helping her organize her medications yesterday, and she reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, showing me a photo of a prescription bottle. It's some kind of medication that can cause dizziness and fainting. The prescription is dated just 2 weeks before your dinner. My heart was pounding as I stared at the image. The pieces were starting to fall into place, forming a picture I almost wished I couldn't see. Helena hadn't just been lying about her allergy. She had actively planned to fake a medical emergency at my dinner. But why? What could she possibly hope to gain? The answer came to me slowly, like a Polaroid developing. The way James had been looking at me since that night, the subtle seeds of doubt she'd been planting for years about my suitability as his wife, the perfectly timed collapse just as I was serving the main course. She wanted to drive a wedge between James and me. And judging by the growing distance I felt from my husband, her plan might be working. The morning after my meeting with Emily, I couldn't shake the image of that prescription bottle from my mind. I sat in my bookstore's office, surrounded by invoices I should have been processing, but instead found myself diving deep into medical websites, researching the medication Emily had photographed. Each new piece of information made my stomach twist tighter. Syncadril, a medication known for causing temporary dizziness, fainting, and symptoms that could mimic an allergic reaction. Prescribed by Dr. Marcus Chen from a private practice in Cambridge. The more I read, the more certain I became that Helena's attack had been carefully orchestrated. I was about to close my laptop when a regular customer, Betty, knocked on my office door. She was a retired nurse who often came in for medical mysteries and romance novels. Something clicked in my mind. Betty, I called out. Do you have a minute? I need your professional opinion on something. She settled into the chair across from my desk, and I carefully described the allergic reaction I'd witnessed, leaving out names and specific details. As I spoke, her brow furrowed. Honey, she said when I finished, I worked in emergency medicine for 30 years. What you're describing doesn't sound like any shellfish allergy I've ever seen. Anaphylaxis has very specific symptoms: hives, throat swelling, difficulty breathing. This sounds more like someone faking it? I suggested quietly. Betty nodded slowly. Or like someone took something to induce those symptoms. We used to see it sometimes in the ER, people looking for attention or trying to manipulate situations. Her words confirmed my worst suspicions, but they also gave me the push I needed. That afternoon, I left Rachel in charge of the store and drove to Helena's house in Chestnut Hill. I knew she had a standing hair appointment on Thursdays, which would give me about 2 hours. James had given me a spare key months ago for emergencies, though I doubted this was the kind of emergency he'd had in mind. The house was silent as I let myself in, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. I felt like a burglar, though I wasn't here to steal anything, only to find the truth. I started in the master bathroom, methodically checking cabinets and drawers. Nothing. The guest bathroom yielded nothing either. I was about to give up when I remembered the small powder room off the study, the one Helena always referred to as her private bathroom. The lock was simple enough to open with a bobby pin. Thank you, misspent youth. Inside, behind a loose panel under the sink that I noticed only because of a slight gap in the caulking, I found what I was looking for. A small wooden box containing 3 prescription bottles of Syncadril, each dated within the past month, along with a notebook. My hands trembled as I opened the notebook. Inside, in Helena's precise handwriting, were detailed notes about the medication's effects, optimal timing for doses, and even a timeline for my birthday dinner. She had planned everything down to the minute, including which guests to invite as witnesses and how long to wait before collapsing. But there was more. The notebook went back months, documenting every slight, real or imagined, that she attributed to me. Sarah's turning him against me. One entry read, James barely calls anymore. Her influence, no doubt. Must take action before it's too late. I photographed everything with shaking hands, making sure to return it exactly as I'd found it. As I was replacing the panel, I heard a car door slam outside. Panic seized me. Helena was home early. I rushed to replace everything, my heart pounding. Through the window, I could see her walking up the front path, engaged in conversation with someone on her phone. I slipped out through the back door just as I heard her key in the front lock, not daring to breathe until I was safely in my car around the corner. That evening, I sat in my parked car outside our brownstone for nearly an hour, trying to decide what to do with what I'd discovered. James was inside. I could see the living room light on through the bay window. How would he react to learning that his mother, the woman he'd idolized his whole life, was capable of such calculated manipulation? My phone buzzed, a text from Helena herself. "Sarah, dear, I think we need to talk about what happened at the dinner. Could you come by tomorrow morning? Just the two of us." The audacity of it made me laugh out loud, a slightly hysterical sound in the quiet car. She still thought she was in control of the situation. She had no idea what I'd discovered. I finally went inside, finding James in his home office, surrounded by patient files. As a pediatrician, he usually left his work at the clinic, but lately, he'd been bringing it home. I suspected to avoid talking about what had happened. "James," I said from the doorway, "we need to talk about your mother." He looked up, his face guarded. "What about her?" "I found something today." I pulled out my phone and showed him the photos I'd taken, the prescription bottles, the notebook, everything. His face went through a range of emotions as he scrolled through them: disbelief, anger, hurt, and finally, a deep sadness that made him look older than his 35 years. "This can't be real," he whispered, but I could see in his eyes that he knew it was. "My mother wouldn't." "She did," I said gently. "And there's more. I've been doing some research. There's no record of her ever having a shellfish allergy. Not at any hospital in Boston. I checked with your Aunt Margaret. She said Helena used to love shrimp cocktail at family parties until about 5 years ago, right around the time you and I started dating." James sat back in his chair, running his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd seen 1,000 times when he was stressed. "All these years," he said, "all those scenes she made about her allergy. The way she'd use it to control where we went, what we did. And I defended her. I made you change all our dinner plans, check every ingredient." "She's meeting with me tomorrow," I told him. "She doesn't know what I found, but she wants to talk about the dinner." His head snapped up. "You're not going alone." "Actually, I think I should." I sat on the edge of his desk, something I used to do often before all this started. "But I want to record the conversation. If she thinks it's just us, she might admit to everything." We stayed up late into the night, planning how to handle the confrontation. James wavered between anger and denial, occasionally getting up to pace the room or stare out the window at the Boston skyline. I could see him replaying memories in his mind, reevaluating every interaction with his mother through this new lens. "You know what the worst part is?" he said as we finally headed to bed around midnight. "I'm a doctor. I should have seen through this." The symptoms never quite matched up with anaphylaxis, but I was so conditioned to believe her that I never questioned it. I squeezed his hand. "She's your mother. You're supposed to be able to trust your mother." The next morning, I prepared for my meeting with Helena like I was going into battle. I wore my most professional outfit, a navy blazer and pencil skirt that always made me feel more confident. The voice recorder app on my phone was ready, and James was going to be parked around the corner, close enough to intervene if needed. As I drove to Helena's house, I thought about all the times she'd manipulated situations over the years. The holidays she'd ruined with her allergy, the restaurants she'd vetoed, the way she'd use her supposed condition to make me look careless or inconsiderate. She had played a long game, trying to drive a wedge between James and me, but she had finally overplayed her hand. The evidence was secure, copies of the photos stored in multiple places, the voice recorder ready to capture whatever happened next. But as I pulled into her driveway, I realized this confrontation wasn't just about gathering proof. It was about standing up to years of manipulation and subtle abuse, not just for my sake, but for James's as well. Helena opened the door wearing one of her perfectly coordinated outfits, her silver hair immaculately styled. She smiled at me, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Sarah, dear," she said, "do come in. We have so much to discuss." I followed her into the house, my heart pounding but my resolve firm. The time for her games was over. The truth was about to come out, and nothing would ever be the same. Helena led me into her formal living room, where morning light streamed through tall windows overlooking her meticulously maintained garden. Everything was perfectly arranged, from the fresh flowers in the Waterford crystal vase to the precisely aligned coffee table books. Just like Helena herself, a carefully curated image of perfection. "Tea," she offered, already moving toward the silver service tray she'd prepared. Her hands were steady as she poured into delicate bone china cups, but I noticed a slight tightness around her mouth. She was nervous, though trying hard not to show it. "Thank you," I said, accepting the cup but not drinking. I'd learned enough about Helena's manipulations to be cautious. "You wanted to talk about the dinner?" She settled into her favorite armchair, smoothing her silk blouse. "Yes, dear. I've been thinking a lot about what happened. It was such a terrible shock to everyone, especially poor James." She paused, watching me over the rim of her teacup. "He's been so upset, so confused about how something like this could have happened." "Has he?" I kept my voice neutral, though my heart was racing. The voice recorder was running in my blazer pocket, capturing every word. "What exactly does he think happened?" "Well," Helena set her cup down with a delicate clink, "he's naturally concerned about how such a dangerous ingredient could have made its way into the food. He knows about my condition, after all. We've all been so careful for years." "Have we?" I interrupted, surprising her. "Been careful about your shellfish allergy, I mean?" Something flickered in her eyes, uncertainty, maybe, or fear. But she recovered quickly. "Of course we have. You know how severe my allergy is. One trace of shellfish and I could have died that night." I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone, pulling up the photos I'd taken. "That's interesting, Helena, because I have here some rather compelling evidence that suggests otherwise." The color drained from her face as I showed her the first photo, the prescription bottle of Sincadril. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. "From your private bathroom. Along with this." I swiped to the next photo, her notebook, open to the page detailing her plans for the dinner. "You planned it all, didn't you? Every detail, down to the minute you would collapse. All to make me look bad in front of James." Helena stood abruptly, her teacup rattling. In its saucer. "You broke into my house? How dare you? I'll call the police." "Go ahead," I said calmly, though my hands were shaking. "I'm sure they'd be very interested in these prescription bottles. Especially since you got them from 3 different doctors who didn't know about each other. That's called prescription fraud, Helena. It's a felony." She sank back into her chair, her perfect posture crumbling. "You don't understand," she said, her voice taking on a pleading tone I'd never heard before. "I had to do something. You're taking him away from me." "Taking him away?" "He's my husband, not your possession. He's a grown man who can make his own choices. He never would have chosen you if I hadn't been sick that day." The words burst out of her like she'd been holding them back for years. "The day you met, he was supposed to meet Caroline Whitman for lunch. I arranged it all. Caroline comes from a good family. She understands our world. But then I had that terrible migraine, and he had to take me to the hospital instead. And there you were, that pretty young nurse." "I wasn't a nurse," I corrected her. "I was visiting my grandmother in the cardiac unit. James and I met in the cafeteria." "It doesn't matter." Helena's voice rose. "You weren't part of the plan. You don't fit. Your little bookstore, your public school teaching job before that. Do you have any idea how people at the club talk about you? About me, for having a daughter-in-law who works retail?" I stared at her, finally seeing the truth of who she was. "So all of this, the fake allergy, the dramatic scenes at restaurants, the collapse at dinner, it was all about social status? About what your country club friends think? It's about family," she insisted. "About maintaining the life we've built. James was meant for more than this. He could have had a private practice on Beacon Hill, married someone who understands our traditions. Instead, He works at that clinic in Dorchester, treating children who can't even pay their bills, and he's married to someone who loves him for exactly who he is. I finished for her. Not for who you want him to be. A noise from the doorway made us both turn. James stood there, his face ashen. Helena's eyes widened in horror. "James," she gasped. "How long have you been standing there?" "Long enough, Mom." His voice was heavy with disappointment. "I heard everything." Helena's transformation was immediate and dramatic. Tears filled her eyes as she rushed toward him. "Darling, you don't understand. I was only trying to protect you. She's turned you against me, can't you see that?" But James stepped back from her outstretched arms. "Stop it, Mom. Just stop. I heard you admit to faking the allergy. I heard why you did it. Do you have any idea how many times I defended you? How many times I made Sarah change her plans, check ingredients, apologize to you?" "I did it for you," Helena insisted. "Everything I've ever done has been for you." "No," James said quietly. "You did it for yourself. For your image. For what people at your precious country club would think." He walked over to stand beside me. "Sarah's right. I love my job at the clinic. I love making a difference in children's lives. And I love her, not in spite of her bookstore or her background, but because of who she is. The only person trying to change me is you." Helena sank back into her chair, her carefully maintained facade crumbling completely. "You don't mean that. You can't." "I do," James said. "And until you can accept that, accept Sarah and who I really am, I think it's better if we don't see each other for a while." "You're choosing her over your own mother?" Helena's voice was barely a whisper. "No, Mom. I'm choosing the truth over lies. I'm choosing to live my life authentically instead of trying to fit into the role you created for me." He took my hand. "We're leaving now. When you're ready to have an honest conversation about everything, you can call me." We walked out of Helena's house together, leaving her sitting in her perfect living room, surrounded by all the trappings of the life she'd tried so hard to preserve. The morning sun was bright, making me squint as we stepped outside. It felt symbolic somehow, stepping out of the shadows of manipulation and into the clear light of truth. In the car, James was quiet for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "I knew, deep down, I think I've always known something wasn't right. But it was easier to believe the lies than to face the truth about who she really is." I reached over and squeezed his hand. "She's still your mother. She just needs to learn that loving someone means accepting them for who they are, not who you want them to be." "Yeah," he sighed, "but that's her journey to make. Right now, I just want to go home." As we drove back to our brownstone, I thought about all the lies that had finally unraveled. Helena's carefully constructed world had fallen apart, but maybe that's what needed to happen for something real and honest to take its place. Only time would tell if she could learn from this, if she could become the mother James deserved. For now, though, the truth was finally out in the open, and that was enough. The next few days passed in a strange blur of normalcy and tension. James and I tried to return to our regular routines, him at the clinic, me at the bookstore, but Helena's presence, or rather her absence, hung over everything like a storm cloud. She'd tried calling James multiple times after our confrontation, but he wasn't ready to talk. Each ignored call felt like another crack in their relationship. A week after the confrontation, Emily came to the bookstore during my lunch break. She looked tired, her usually perfectly styled hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. "Mom's losing it," she said without preamble, sliding into the chair across from my desk. "She's been calling everyone in the family, trying to tell her version of what happened." "What version is that?" I asked, already dreading the answer. "That you broke into her house, planted evidence to frame her, and turned James against her." Emily rolled her eyes. "The problem is, no one's buying it anymore. Aunt Margaret finally told everyone about the shrimp cocktail thing, how Mom used to love it before you came along. And Cousin Rebecca, who's a pharmacist, recognized the medication names from the photos you took. She said there's no way those were prescribed for allergies." I leaned back in my chair, processing this information. "How's she taking that?" "Not well." Emily pulled out her phone and showed me a series of increasingly frantic texts from Helena. "She keeps switching between playing the victim and making threats. She's talking about going to the medical board about James, claiming he's been enabling prescription drug abuse or something. My heart sank. She wouldn't. She would. Emily's voice was grim. But here's where she really messed up. She sent these threats in writing. To everyone. The whole family's seen them now. Just then, my phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. You need to see this. Attached was a link to a post in our local community Facebook group. Helena had written a long, rambling message about how I had poisoned her at the birthday dinner and was now poisoning her son against her. The comments were a mix of concern and skepticism, with several people pointing out inconsistencies in her story. She's self-destructing, Emily said, reading over my shoulder. And she doesn't even realize it. The bell over the bookstore door chimed, and we both looked up to see Tom, Emily's husband, rushing in. You need to come home, he told Emily. Your mother just showed up at our house. She's demanding to see the kids. Emily's face paled. She knows it's not her day to visit. She's not herself, Tom said carefully. I told her she needs to leave, but she's refusing. She's sitting in her car in the driveway, calling the kids' phones directly. I watched Emily gather her things with shaking hands. This was a new level of escalation. Helena had always been manipulative, but this was becoming dangerous. Do you want me to call James? I offered. Emily nodded. Please. And Sarah, be careful. When Mom feels cornered, she gets unpredictable. After they left, I called James at the clinic. He listened to what was happening, his silence on the other end speaking volumes. I'll handle it, he finally said. I should have known she wouldn't just accept this. That evening, our house felt like a war room. James, Emily, Tom, and I sat around our dining room table, the same one where this had all started with that fateful dinner, trying to figure out what to do. James's phone kept lighting up with messages from family members, each with their own story about Helena's behavior over the years. Aunt Catherine just texted, he said, scrolling through his phone. Apparently, Mom pulled something similar with Dad before their divorce. She faked health issues to get sympathy and turn people against him. I was too young to remember, but Catherine said it was one of the reasons he left. Why didn't anyone tell us this before? Emily demanded. Because Mom isolated us from that side of the family after the divorce, James replied. Remember how she always had an excuse for why we couldn't attend family events on Dad's side? She controlled the narrative our entire lives. A knock at the door made us all jump. Through the front window, we could see Helena standing on our porch, still wearing the clothes she'd had on at Emily's house hours earlier. She looked disheveled, nothing like her usual polished self. Don't answer it, Emily whispered, but James was already moving toward the door. Mom, he said as he opened it, you need to go home. Home. Helena's laugh had a hysterical edge to it. Where's that? My own children won't speak to me, my friends are all whispering behind my back, and it's all because of her. She pointed at me, her finger shaking. She turned you against me, poisoned you with her lies. The only one who's been lying is you, James said firmly. We have proof, Mom. The prescriptions, the notebook, everything. It's over. It's not over until I say it's over. Helena tried to push past him into the house, but James stood his ground. I'm your mother. You can't just throw me away because of some gold digger who seduced you in a hospital cafeteria. That's enough. James's voice cracked like a whip, making Helena step back. You want to know why Sarah's better than you, Mom? Because she's never tried to change who I am. She supports my work at the clinic, encourages me to help people, loves me for myself, not some idealized version she created in her head. Helena's face crumpled. I gave you everything. The best schools, the best opportunities. And I'm grateful for that, James said, his voice softening slightly. But you didn't give me the one thing I really needed, the freedom to be myself. I don't understand, Helena whispered. What's wrong with wanting the best for your children? Nothing, Emily said, joining her brother at the door. But your version of the best was always about you, Mom. About your status, your reputation, your control. Helena looked between her children, reality finally seeming to sink in. The mask she'd worn for so long was cracking, revealing the scared, controlling woman beneath. I don't know how to be any other way, she admitted. Then get help, James said. Real help, Mom. Not more manipulations, not more lies. See a therapist. Work through why you feel the need to control everything and everyone around you. When you're ready to have an honest relationship with us, with all of us, we'll be here. But for now, Emily added, you need to leave. And you need to stop harassing us, our spouses, and our children. Or we'll have to take legal action. Helena stared at them for a long moment, tears streaming down her face. Then, without another word, she turned and walked back to her car. We watched from the window as she drove away, her taillights disappearing into the gathering darkness. The house felt eerily quiet after she left. We all sat in the living room, emotionally exhausted. Do you think she'll really get help? I asked no one in particular. I don't know, James replied. But for the first time in her life, she doesn't have a choice. She's lost control of the narrative, and that's something she's never had to face before. Emily leaned against Tom, looking drained. I keep thinking about all the times she manipulated us over the years. The birthdays she ruined, the relationships she sabotaged. How did we not see it? Because she was good at it, I said. And because she's your mother. You were supposed to be able to trust her. As the night wore on, family members kept calling and texting, offering support and sharing their own stories of Helena's manipulations over the years. It was like a dam had broken, decades of secrets and suspicions flowing out into the open. Later, after Emily and Tom had gone home, James and I lay in bed, both too wired to sleep. I keep waiting to feel guilty, he admitted. She's my mother. I should feel worse about cutting her off like this. I rolled over to face him. You haven't cut her off. You've given her a chance to become someone. Better. Someone who can have a real relationship with her children. That's not cruelty, it's love. 3 months passed, and Boston's harsh winter had settled in. The streets of Beacon Hill were dusted with snow, and holiday decorations appeared in windows throughout the neighborhood. It was usually Helena's favorite time of year. She'd always hosted elaborate Christmas parties that were the talk of her social circle. This year, though, things were different. After her meltdown on our doorstep, Helena had disappeared from our lives for several weeks. The only updates we got came through family friends who reported seeing her around town, looking less put together than usual. She'd resigned from her positions on various charity boards, dropped her country club membership, and seemed to be retreating from the social scene she'd once dominated. Then, about 6 weeks after our confrontation, James received a letter. Not an email or a text, but a handwritten letter on Helena's expensive stationery. I was in the kitchen making coffee when he read it, watching his face for clues. She's in therapy, he said finally, looking up from the pages. Twice a week with a psychiatrist in Cambridge. She says she's been diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder and anxiety. I sat down beside him at our breakfast nook. How do you feel about that? Relieved, I think. He passed me the letter. Read it yourself. It's different from her usual manipulation tactics. She actually admits to things, takes responsibility. The letter was indeed unlike anything I'd seen from Helena before. Gone were the dramatic flourishes and subtle guilt trips. Instead, she wrote plainly about her behavior, acknowledging the harm she'd caused. She explained how her own mother had been similarly controlling, how she'd internalized those patterns and perpetuated them with her own children. It wasn't an excuse, she wrote, but an explanation she was just beginning to understand herself. She wants to meet, James said as I finished reading. Not here, not at her house, but on neutral ground, with her therapist present. I looked at him carefully. Do you want to? I think I do. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd come to recognize as him working through difficult emotions. Emily, too, if she's willing. Mom suggests meeting at her therapist's office next week. Emily agreed to the meeting, though she insisted Tom come along for support. On the appointed day, we all gathered in Dr. Patterson's comfortable office in Cambridge. Helena was already there when we arrived, sitting straight-backed in an armchair, but without her usual air of superiority. She looked smaller somehow, more human. Dr. Patterson, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, guided us through what turned out to be an intense 2-hour session. Helena had prepared statements for each of us, reading them in a voice that sometimes shook with emotion. She detailed specific instances of manipulation, acknowledging how her actions had hurt us all. "The dinner," she said, looking at me directly for the first time, "was my lowest point. I'd convinced myself that if I could just make James see you as careless, as wrong for him, everything would go back to how I wanted it. I didn't just lie about the allergy, I lied about who I was, who my son was, what family should mean. I'm deeply ashamed of that now. The healing didn't happen in a single session, of course. It took months of regular meetings, both with and without Dr. Patterson present. Sometimes we made progress. Other times, old patterns would emerge, and we'd have to step back and regroup. Helena struggled particularly with accepting that James and Emily's lives wouldn't match her original vision for them. "But they're good lives," she said during one session, sounding almost surprised. "James, your clinic. I visited last week. Just sat in the waiting room for a while, watching. The way those children look at you, the way their parents trust you. It's different from the private practice I imagined, but it's beautiful in its own way." Christmas approached, and we faced the question of how to handle the holidays. Helena had always insisted on hosting, but this year, Emily suggested something different, a potluck at her house, everyone contributing a dish, no formal place settings or rigid expectations. Helena agreed, though she admitted to Dr. Patterson that the loss of control made her anxious. "I keep wanting to take over, to make everything perfect," she said. "But I'm learning that perfect isn't always better." The day of the gathering, Helena arrived early to help Emily set up. I watched from the kitchen as she struggled not to reorganize the casual table settings, her hands twitching toward the slightly mismatched plates. But she took a deep breath and stepped back, choosing instead to focus on teaching her grandchildren how to make the paper snowflakes she'd always created for her own parties. During dinner, someone accidentally knocked over a glass of red wine. In the past, Helena would have made a scene about the expensive tablecloth. This time, she was the first to laugh, helping to clean up while sharing a story about a similar incident from her own childhood. "Mom seems different," James said as we drove home that night. "More real." "She's trying," I agreed. "It's not perfect, but it's progress." The new year brought more changes. Helena sold her large house in Chestnut Hill, moving to a smaller, but still elegant apartment in Cambridge. "Too many rooms filled with things I thought I needed to impress people," she explained. "I'm learning to live with less control, less perfection." She began volunteering at a local food bank, something her former self would have considered beneath her social status. At first, I suspected it was another manipulation tactic, but as weeks passed, she seemed to find genuine fulfillment in the work. "These people don't care what country club I belong to," she told me over coffee one day. "They just care that I show up and help." 1 year after the fateful dinner, we all gathered again, this time at our house, my choice entirely. I made a seafood pasta, and yes, it contained shrimp. Helena took a small portion, eating it without drama or fanfare. The conversation flowed naturally, touching on work, family, and future plans without the undercurrent of judgment that had once characterized our gatherings. After dinner, I found Helena in our kitchen, quietly loading the dishwasher. "You don't have to do that," I said. "I want to," she replied, then added with a small smile, "and I promise I'm not rearranging everything to my standards." Much. We worked together in comfortable silence for a moment before she spoke again. "Sarah, I know I can never fully make up for what I did. The manipulation, the lies, trying to come between you and James, it was unforgivable." "But not unforgivable," I corrected gently. "We're here, aren't we?" She nodded, wiping her hands on a dish towel. I had this image in my head of what my life should be, what my children's lives should be. I held onto it so tightly that I couldn't see the beauty in what was actually there. I'm trying to learn to see things as they are, not as I think they should be. That's all any of us can do, I said, and meant it. Later that evening, as our guests prepared to leave, I watched Helena hug her grandchildren goodbye. Her embrace was genuine now, not the stiff, photo-ready pose she'd once preferred. She was learning to love people as they were, not as props in her carefully constructed world. The road ahead wouldn't always be smooth. Helena still had moments of trying to control situations, of falling back into old patterns. But now there was awareness, a willingness to recognize and correct these behaviors. She was doing the work, day by day, choice by choice. As for me, I'd learned something too. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or excusing past actions. It means choosing to move forward, to allow space for growth and change. Helena would always be capable of manipulation, but she was also capable of growth, of love, of genuine connection. The choice of which path to take was hers to make every day. James squeezed my hand as we waved goodbye to the last of our guests. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For not giving up. On any of us." I looked out at the night sky, where snow was beginning to fall again. Each flake followed its own path, creating a pattern more beautiful than any single person could design. Sometimes the best things in life are the ones we can't control.